this tutorial we're going to be learning 3 different ways of joining granny squares with just slip stitches. So before we jump into the first of the 3 joins, I'm going to give you a few tips to help you get started. The first is that once you've laid out your squares in the order that you want them, use locking stitch markers or something like safety pins, bobby pins, bits of scrap yarn to temporarily join your granny squares together, and this helps keep you organised and prevent you getting in a muddle when you're crocheting these seams. My second tip is that we're going to be working all 3 of these seams in a grid pattern. So that means we first work all of our horizontal seams, then we go back and work all of the vertical seams. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to be joining 4 squares at a time, but these seams work for any number of granny squares. So just make sure you're working in that grid pattern. So let's jump into our first join. The first seam we're going to learn is the zigzag seam. So like I just said, we're going to start by working this horizontal seam here. So this is the first seam we're going to work. So the first step is to put a slip knot on your hook, and if you've watched my tutorials before, you know I usually teach a knotless slip knot method. However, whenever I'm doing a crocheted seam like this, I much prefer to do an actual knot for my slip knot. So to make an actual slip knot, you can use any method that you prefer, but I like to make a loop of yarn and then pop one of my ends through it like that, and then I pull it to tighten. But like I said, you can use any method of creating a slip knot you like, as long as it's not that knotless one, because it does have a tendency to come loose here. So there's my slip knot on my crochet hook. And then I'm going to pick up this first square here, and we're going to start in this corner and this corner. So I'm going to pick up my crochet square and into that chain 2 space in the corner, or if you're working a granny square that has a stitch in this corner, whatever the corner stitch is, whether it's a space or a stitch, what we're going to do is we're going to do a slip stitch into it. So I'm going to put my hook into that corner space, yarn over and pull up a loop through that loop there. So there's my first slip stitch done. And I'm going to pick up my second square, and in the equivalent corner here I'm going to do a slip stitch in there as well. So doing that slip stitch through that corner space there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to slip stitch in each stitch across, alternating between the squares, and that's what gives us this zigzag pattern. When we're doing the slip stitches, we need to work under both of the loops. So I'm going under both of the loops of that stitch just after the chain space there, and I'm going to do a slip stitch. Then I'm going to move over, and this is the first stitch after the space here, so I'm going to do a slip stitch under both of those loops. Then I'm going to repeat this and move on to the next stitch. So I'm going to do a slip stitch in the next stitch of this square here, and then a slip stitch into the next stitch of this second square, so this square here. So I'm going in here, and we're going to repeat these steps all the way along until we reach the next corner space. So let's do one more repeat of these slip stitches together. Then my next stitch up here is this one, so I'm going under both loops and doing a slip stitch. So repeat those steps all the way along until you reach these chain 2 corner spaces here, and work a slip stitch into each of them. And then I'll meet you here and I'll show you how we navigate this corner and how we move over into working this seam along here, because we're just going to continuously work in that grid pattern all the way along this horizontal seam. So this is what your zigzag join should look like at this point, and my last slip stitch was in the last stitch of this top square here, so I need to do a slip stitch into each of these chain 2 spaces. So I'm going to work my next slip stitch in that space and my next stitch in that space there. So now I've reached the end of this seam, and we're going to start joining these 2 squares, and we're not going to break our yarn here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the next square, do a slip stitch into the corner space. So it's important here that my last slip stitch was in this top square, so I'm going to go down here and make sure my next slip stitch is in the next square that's diagonal from that last slip stitch. So I'm not going in this square, I'm going in this square down here, and that just maintains that zigzag pattern. So I'm going to slip stitch in this chain 2 space here, and then I'm going to pick up this second square and slip stitch in this chain 2 space here. That slip stitch, and then I'm going to do exactly what we did before. We're just going to slip stitch in each stitch across, alternating between the 2 squares, and then continue working like this all the way across all of your squares until you reach the very end. So if you're joining more squares, you'll continue this joint all the way along, but once you reach the end of this seam, I'll meet you here and I'll show you how we fasten off. So I've continued working that zigzag join all the way along to the end of my granny squares, and my last 2 slip stitches were in the chain 2 spaces of my last 2 squares. So to fasten off in the zigzag join, make a chain of 1, cut your yarn, then use your crochet hook to pull that yarn tail through that chain 1 and give it a little tug to tighten. So now we've finished doing this first seam, you now need to repeat the process for all of your horizontal seams, and then come back to this tutorial and I'll show you what's slightly different for our vertical joins. So now let's work the vertical seam. I'm just going to spin my crochet around a little bit, and I've already put a slip knot on my crochet hook. And a big tip for working these vertical seams is you need your yarn to go behind our crochet. So make sure our yarn is like this, so the yarn is underneath where these seams cross over, because if you reach one of these corners and your yarn is over the top of your seam like this when you're doing slip stitches here, it becomes really difficult to work your slip stitches. So yeah, top tip, make sure your working yarn is underneath all of your crochet. So it's underneath here. So I'm going to then get ready to do this seam, and I'm going to work this seam just as we did all of our horizontal seams. So starting in these corner spaces and working our way along, literally exactly the same as our horizontal seams. So work your zigzag seam all the way along until you're almost at this corner here, and then come back to this tutorial because this corner can be a little tricky to navigate, so I want to make sure that we nail it. So I've worked my way along doing this seam and I'm almost at the corner space. I've just done a slip stitch in this final stitch, and as you can see I've got a big loop of my working yarn here, and that's where I've been crocheting kind of on the top of my crochet. But at this point I find it's easiest to now swap to having the working yarn at the back of your work. So I'm going to pull on my yarn and get rid of this big baggy loop, and I'll show you how we do the next few slip stitches. So what I'm doing is I'm holding my yarn, but my working yarn is now at the back of my work. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be flipping my crochet over so you can see what I'm doing on both sides. So for the next slip stitch I'm going in this chain space here and put my hook in it, and then I'm going to flip my crochet over to the back so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to yarn over and pull a loop to the front and do that slip stitch. So I'm now going to work a slip stitch into this corner space here as well. So I'm going to put my hook into that space there. I'm going to flip my crochet over and see what I'm doing. I'm going to yarn over, I'm going to pull a loop up through that corner space and do that slip stitch. So now I'm just going to remove this next stitch marker, and I'm going to have my yarn now back at the front of my crochet. It was just a little bit too difficult to do the slip stitches here if you kept it at the front of the work. So now we're going to move straight across into the diagonal square. So my last slip stitch was in this square, so now my next slip stitch is going to be in this square in that corner. So exactly the same as we did on the horizontal seams there, and then in this one here. So continue working that zigzag slip stitch join all the way along, working those corners just as we've just done, and then work all of the rest of your seams until all of your granny squares are joined. I really love the look of this join as it's really obvious and in your face, and it looks so decorative. So yeah, let's move on to our next join, which is a lot more subtle. The next seam we're going to learn is slip stitch in the back loops So for our first join, we worked with the right sides of our squares facing upwards. For this join, we're going to be working with the wrong sides facing out. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to fold my squares together. So again, we're working the horizontal seam first, then the vertical seam. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take if you've got multiple rows, you just need to fold over your first row. So I'm going to fold this first row over onto the top of my second row with the right, so this is the right sides of the square with the right sides facing each other. So we've got the wrong sides facing out. Then I like to pick up my squares for this join like this because it's a lot easier to see what I'm doing from the top like this. So before we learn this join, it's really important that we can identify the front and back loops of our crochet. So I've got a needle here just so I can point a little bit easier so you can see what I'm looking at. So usually when we do a crochet stitch, we go under both of the loops at the top of the stitch. The loops at the top of the stitch make this sort of V shape and we go under both of the loops. However, we can work under the front loops, so that's just, we would be putting our hook in there, or in the back loops, so putting our hook in there. And for this join, we're going to be working into these back loops only, but it gets a little bit confusing because the back loop of the square that's closest to us is actually the front loop. So we're looking at this from the back. So our front loop is this loop and our back loop is this loop, but if I turn that over, it's actually the front loop facing us. So I'm saying the back loop, I'm not saying the back loop in orientation to what you're looking at, I'm saying that it's the back loop when you're looking at the stitch from the front. I am going to be showing you step by step where I'm putting my hook, so if that doesn't make sense, it will once we start crocheting. So I've put a slip knot on my crochet hook. I'm going to pick up my squares again. So this join works best when you have a chain 2 corner. It looks a little bit messy if you try and do it where you've got a corner stitch or an odd number of chains in this corner. It is possible, it does work, but I'm going to show you it for 2 chains because that's what most of my granny square patterns have. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify our first 2 chains of the corner here. Well, they're the only 2 chains of the corner. So we've got 1, 2, and we're looking at the back loops, remember, because this front square, the back loops face us. So there's my first chain and there's my second chain. So under the back loop only of the second chain, I'm going to put my hook. So my hook is going, so here's my second chain, my hook is going in there like that. If I bring that over so you can kind of see from the top, so I've gone through the back loop from the back of the square like that. And then I'm going to go through the back loop of the second chain of this corner 2 space here. So there's my first chain, there's my second chain, and there is my back loop. My hook's going under that loop there. So if I bring this round so you can see where I've put my hook, hopefully. There, so I've gone in the back loop of that second chain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slip stitch those 2 back loops together. So I'm going to yarn over, pull through both of those loops and then through the loop on my hook. So I've just made a slip stitch through those 2 back loops and we're going to continue this all the way along. So I'll work a few of these with you because it can be a little bit confusing at first. So for the next stitch, my hook is going under the loop that's facing me. So the back loop of the next stitch there. And then the back loop of the next stitch there. I'm going to do a slip stitch. Okay, and again, so I'm going in this back loop of this stitch here, and then the back loop of the equivalent stitch on that back square. I'm going to make a slip stitch. I'm going to repeat this all the way along until I reach the next corner space. And I will meet you there and I'll show you how we navigate the corners. So I've slip stitched all the way along and I just want to show you what this looks like. So that is what your crochet should be looking like. And if I open my squares up, that's what a seam looks like. And if I pull on this slightly, you can see why I said if we use a coordinating colour, it's not very obvious because I'm using a contrast colour to show you. Yeah, it can be quite obvious from the front, but I think it kind of looks like little stitches have been sewn for the squares together and it's not very obvious unless you kind of pull. But yeah, anyways, let's work this corner. So my last slip stitch that I did before I started filming again was this last stitch before the chain 2 space. And we're going to work the first chain of this slip stitch join. So we're just going to work this first chain. We're going to go through the back loops again. So we're not going into the spaces because then our join is really obvious from the front. We're going into the back loops of the chains again. So I'm going under that back loop of the first chain there. And then I'm going to pick up that back loop there, the back square there, and do my slip stitch. And then we've now finished seaming these two squares, and we're going to start seaming these two squares here. And to do that, we simply just repeat the steps straight from here. So I'm going to go through this back loop of the second chain of these corners. So I'm skipping this chain here, going in the back loop there of that second chain of the corner, and the equivalent back loop on the back stitch. So there. I'm going to do a slip stitch, just like that. So continue slip stitching across until you've completely finished your seam. So you'll probably have a lot more squares to join than just my two here. So continue slip stitching all the way along until you're right at the very end of your squares, and then come back to this tutorial and I'll show you how we fasten off and how we work our vertical seams. So I've continued working slip stitches all the way along, and I'm just about to work my last slip stitch, and my last slip stitch is in the back loops of the first chain of these corners here. So that's my last slip stitch. And we're going to fasten off just like we did with the first join. So yarn over, pull through to create a chain, and I'm going to snip my yarn and then use my hook to pull it through, give it a tug to fasten off here. So if we now open up, I'll reveal the join to you. So there we go. That is what your seam should look like. And as you can see, especially in the corners, you can really see the colour of the seam from the front, but I don't mind that. It depends on the project. So yeah, continue working all of your horizontal seams and then come back to this tutorial and I'll show you what's different for our vertical seams. So I've put a slip knot on my hook ready to start our first vertical seam, and I'm going to fold my crochet over just like we did before, so we're looking at the wrong sides of our squares. And we're going to start working the vertical seam just as we did with the horizontal seam. So we're starting in that second chain of the chain 2 corner in the back loops only, and we're going to slip stitch all the way across. And what I'll do is I'll meet you at this corner here because this can get a little bit tricky to navigate. So I'll show you how we navigate this because that's what's different from the horizontal and the vertical seam. So yeah, I'll meet you here once you've slip stitched across your first square. So I've worked my slip stitches all the way along, and I've just done a slip stitch in the last stitch before the chain 2 corner space. And if you remember when we did our horizontal seams, we just worked one of the chains of the corner spaces. So what we're going to do is we're going to work the unworked chain here. And these can get a little bit tight, so they might be a little bit tricky to find. So I'm going to go under those back loops of the first chain of the corner chain 2 there. And then we've now finished joining these two, and to move over into the next square we simply just slip stitch in the next stitch. We don't need to do any chains or anything here, we literally just make a slip stitch in the second chain of the next 2 squares. So this unworked chain here, I'm going in the back loops again to make a slip stitch. And then I'm going to continue this all the way along the seam. And then I'll meet you at the end of here and I'll show you what our finished seam looks like. So I've now finished my vertical seam, and here is the big reveal. So this is what the seam looks like from the front, and it doesn't quite lay flat, but when you make a blanket, eventually it kind of like the weight of the blanket like forces the squares to be flat. And then if I turn it over, there is an obvious ridge on the back where we've joined those granny squares. So yeah, this is a great crocheted alternative to my invisible seam tutorial that I'll link down in the description if you like the look of this, but you would really love this to be an invisible seam. So yeah, I'll link that down in the description, and then let's move on to our third and final join. The final join we're going to learn is the flat slip stitch seam. So the way this join is worked is kind of a combination of the first 2 joins. So we're going to be working with our squares from the front, and we're going to be kind of having our yarn towards the back of our work for some of it like we did with the first join, but we're going to be working into the back loops only again. So I've got a slip knot on my hook ready to work this join. So my first tip again is we're going to be working with our yarn at the back of our work. So I'm going to pop my yarn underneath my square saw at the back of the work, and this just keeps us nice and neat. So my yarn over here, you can see it's tucked underneath. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up this first square. I'm going to find the second chain of my chain 2 corner. So chain 1, chain 2. This join does work with like a chain 3 corner, but it doesn't look as neat. So I'm going to go into that second chain there. I'm going to go in the back loop only from the front. So I'm going in there. I'm not making a slip stitch or anything, I'm just putting my hook in it. And then I'm going to pick up my second square and making sure my yarn is at the back, pick up my second square. This gets a little bit fiddly, it might be a little bit easier for me to turn my squares a bit like that. So, and then I picked up my second square, I'm going to find the equivalent chain. So there's my chain 2 corner, I'm going in this second chain here and I'm going in the back loop again. So I'm putting my hook in there, in that back loop. And now I'm going to make a slip stitch. So yarn over, I'm going to pull through first that one, then that one, and then that one to make my first slip stitch there. And then we're going to repeat this all the way along, making sure we always go in the front square first rather than the back square. That just keeps our join nice and flat. So I'm going in the back loop of the next stitch, and then the back loop of the next stitch there. Yarn over and pull through all the loops to make a slip stitch. You can see that flat seam starting to take shape. So let's work a couple of these slip stitches together. So I'm going in the back loop of the next stitch, then the back loop of the next stitch of the other square, yarn over, pull through that loop, through that loop, pull through that loop. And again, so I'm going in the back loop of this front square and then the back loop of the next stitch of the back square and making a slip stitch. And my next stitch is a chain. So with all of these seams you can work into chains as well as stitches. So I'm going to go in the back loop of this chain here and the back loop of the equivalent chain over there. I haven't quite got all of that, there we go. Yarn over and pull through all of that. So continue working slip stitches like this all the way along until you reach your corner, and I will meet you here. So I've continued working slip stitches all the way along until the last slip stitch that I did was in the first chain only of that chain 2 corner. So we're going to be doing something similar in our corner to the last join, where we work one chain of the chain 2 corner space and one on the horizontal pass, and then one chain of the corner on the vertical pass of the seam. So to move on to the next 2 squares, what we're going to do is we are going to basically just move on, but here we need to make sure our yarn is remaining behind our crochet, because if you have it say up here while you're trying to do the slip stitch, it gets really messy. So to keep it neat, keep your yarn behind your crochet squares like this. Then we're going to do a slip stitch into the back loop only of the second chain of this chain 2 corner here, so the front square again. So I've put my hook in there just like we did over here, and then I'm going to find the next one, making sure the yarn is behind our work and not over here somewhere. I find that equivalent chain and go in the back loop just like that, just like we did over here. It's exactly the same. Then make that slip stitch, and I find this stitch gets quite loose, so we need to make sure we're doing it with our normal tension. Doesn't need to be extra tight or anything, it just needs to be in our normal tension. So there, so we're now moved on to the next 2 squares, and I'm going to work my slip stitches just like I did along here, along these 2 squares, and I'm going to continue like this all the way along until the end of the seam, so you will have more squares than me. Future M here, I actually realised I forgot to say that your final slip stitch should be in the first chain only of these 2 chain corners, and then you do your chain 1 and fasten off there. So yeah, we'll go back to what I was saying previously. So that's how you do your horizontal seam. So work all of your horizontal seams for this join. then come back to this tutorial and I'll show you what we do differently for our vertical seams. And what I'll do is you need to work your vertical seams exactly the same as your horizontal seams, but meet me back here when you're doing this first corner and I'll show you how we navigate going back across this corner here. So here I am on the vertical seam and I've slip stitched my way along, and my last slip stitch was in this final stitch before the corner space. And what we're going to do is we're going to do something really similar to what we did with the first seam, where at the minute I've got a big loop of yarn here at the front, but we need to make sure we're keeping this yarn at the back. So I'm going to pull on my working yarn and get rid of that loop, and then we're going to work this final slip stitch of these 2 squares. So I've got my yarn at the back here. I'm gonna put my hook in that back loop of the next chain here that was unworked, and then the chain here like that. Put my hook to the back of my work and I'm going to flip my crochet over just like we did with the first seam. I'm going to do yarn over and pull through. Ooh. There we go. It took me a little bit of time to get that yarn over and pull through. Right, so that's our last slip stitch of these 2 squares, and then we're going to go over the top of our seam from the previous pass, our horizontal seam, and I'm going to immediately slip stitch in the back loops of the next 2 squares. So I'm going to go in that loop there and then in that loop again, and flip my crochet over and do that slip stitch just so that I can get access to it a bit easier, and I'm making sure that I'm always keeping the yarn at the back of my work. And then continue slip stitching across, finish off your row just as we've done previously, and then do all of your vertical seams. And I'll meet you back here and I'll show you what our finished seam looks like. So this is what our flat seam looks like from the front and from the back. If you'd like the patterns for all of the granny squares used in this tutorial, I'll link them down in the description, and I'll pop another tutorial here that you might like to try next.